He signed the termination notice with the same pen that didn't work on his first try. His name, spelled correctly. His employee number, correct. The date, correct. Everything on that paper was accurate except the part that said he had done something he had not done. He stood up, walked past the man who had framed him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Ronald, what? Your lanyard?" "It's showing." The man's hand flew to his collar before his brain caught up. Fingers finding the key he wasn't supposed to have on him. Eyes finding Daniel's. Neither of them said anything. Daniel walked out $38 in his wallet. A 7-year-old at home with paper stuffed in the toe of her shoe because he hadn't been able to afford new ones. And somewhere across town, the man who built the system that just destroyed him was sitting in a white suit, reading a morning report, completely certain that the problem named Daniel Lopez had been handled. He was wrong, but he wouldn't know that yet. Friends, before this story begins, one question. Have you ever done the right thing on the worst day of your life? Not because someone was watching. Not because you expected anything back. Just because there was still something left in you that wasn't for sale. This man did. And what happened next changed everything. Not the way you think. The heater in the break room at Meridian Supply Group had been broken for 11 days. Daniel Lopez knew this because he had reported it twice. Once on a Tuesday, once on the following Monday, both times through the online maintenance portal that generated a ticket number and then, as far as anyone could tell, generated absolutely nothing else. The ticket numbers existed somewhere in a server. The code existed in the actual room where actual people sat during their actual breaks and tried to remember what warm felt like. It was 6:51 in the morning. End of a 12-hour night shift. Daniel could see his own breath in the break room air, which said something about the month of October in Atlanta and something more specific about a building where facilities management considered a ticket number the same thing as a solution. He was signing out on the clipboard by the door. The pen didn't work on the first pass. He pressed harder, drew small circles in the upper corner of the page until the ink decided to cooperate, then printed his name the way he always printed it. Clean, deliberate. The handwriting of a man whose mother had been a school administrator and had opinions about legible signatures. He was 32 years old. He had been awake for 17 hours. He had $38 in his wallet and a 7-year-old daughter at home who believed, with the specific and unshakable certainty of someone who had not yet learned to doubt the people she loved, that her father was going to be okay. He tried, most mornings, to be worth that certainty. Lopez, he didn't turn around immediately. He knew the voice the way you know the sound of a particular car engine. Ronald Sanchez, shift supervisor, 46 years old, the kind of man who wore the company polo shirt even on days nobody required it, like the logo was something he'd earned and intended to display. Lopez. White needs you, office. There was something in the way Sanchez said now. Not urgency, not irritation. More like a man who had already seen the last scene of a movie and was watching you walk toward it. Daniel turned around. Sanchez stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression of someone who was not going to give anything away. He was built wide, not tall. Dark complexion, salt and pepper hair cut close to the skull. The kind of eyes that were always calculating something even when the rest of his face was doing nothing. Daniel had worked under Ronald Sanchez for 2 years and 9 months. In that time he had noticed 3 things consistently. Sanchez never remembered birthdays, which was fine. Sanchez never acknowledged when someone had done good work, which was less fine but not unusual. And Sanchez wore his key lanyard inside his shirt, which was unusual. Because company protocol said the cold storage master key stayed in the supervisor's lockbox at the end of every shift, not against a man's chest under a polo shirt, invisible to everyone but him. Daniel had never mentioned the lanyard to anyone. He was starting to think that had been a mistake. The walk from the break room to George White's office was about 300 feet, past the loading dock where the overnight crew was finishing up, past the row of forklifts parked in the yellow-lined bays, past the bulletin board where someone had taped up a flyer for a retirement party that had happened 6 weeks ago and not been taken down. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in that particular frequency that felt specifically designed to make a tired person feel worse. The whole building smelled like cardboard, diesel, and the faint medicinal sweetness of the industrial floor cleaner they used twice a week. George White's door was open. That was the first thing. When George White closed his door, he was on a call with his daughter or eating the lunch his wife packed him in the blue insulated bag he'd had for 4 years. When his door was open, it meant he wanted the moment witnessed. It meant the openness was performing a function. Daniel went in. George White was 52 years old with gray at both temples. The kind of build that had been substantial when he played college ball and had settled comfortably into middle age without apologizing for it. He had a photo of his grandchildren on the corner of his desk and a coffee mug his son-in-law had given him as a joke. George was the kind of manager who knew his employees' names, asked after their families, and remembered details he had no obligation to remember. Daniel had always respected that. Right now, George was looking at his desk, not at Daniel, at the desk. That was the second thing, Daniel. A pause. There's been a situation with the Crestview health shipment from last Tuesday. Daniel sat down without being asked. I remember that shipment. 16 crates didn't arrive. Didn't arrive where? Anywhere. George picked up a pen, clicked it twice. Set it down. They were logged out of here, on your manifest. But when the truck reached the Columbus facility, the 16 crates weren't on it. The room had a quality of silence that Daniel was starting to understand was not accidental. He could hear Sanchez behind him against the wall. He could hear the distant clatter of the dock crew wrapping up. He could hear his own breathing, which was steadier than he expected. I loaded that truck. I signed off on 31 pallets. I closed out the dock at 11:59. I know. I've closed out Dock 4 for every Tuesday for 2 years and 9 months. I know that too, Daniel. Then I'm not understanding what this conversation is. George finally looked up, and there it was. The thing Daniel had been reading since he walked into this room. George White had the eyes of a man who had been arguing with himself all night and had lost. Not lost the argument, lost the war. Surrendered to something bigger than his own discomfort. There was footage, George said, from the dock camera. Tuesday at 11:48, Daniel alone in frame for 7 minutes. I was closing out. That's the job. I know it's the job, George. Are you firing me? George pushed a piece of paper across the desk. Pre-printed. Already signed by someone in HR whose name Daniel didn't recognize. Termination notice. Pending investigation. Probable cause. Loss of company property. Daniel picked it up. His name was spelled correctly. His employee number was correct. The date was correct. Everything about the document was correct except for the part where it described him as someone who had done something he had not done. The insurance company is driving this, George said quietly. And corporate. They need somebody off payroll while the investigation runs. If you're cleared, I have a 7-year-old daughter. The words came out flat, not angry, just factual. Her mother has been gone 4 years. Rent is due on the 15th. I know, Daniel. I know all of it. I'm sorry. Daniel believed him. He believed George White was genuinely, specifically sorry. He also understood that being sorry and being able to do anything about it were 2 entirely different categories of thing. He picked up the pen and signed the notice. On his way out, he walked close enough to Sanchez that their shoulders almost touched. He didn't look at him. He waited until he reached the doorway. Ronald, what? Your lanyard. It's showing. Sanchez's hand moved to his collar before he could stop it. Fingers pressing against his chest, finding the cord, the key, his eyes found Daniel's. Something moved through them. Not guilt exactly. More like the recalibration of a man who had just been reminded that other people had eyes. Daniel walked out without looking back. The parking lot at 7:04 in the morning had that specific quality that parking lots get at shift change. A few cars pulling in, a few pulling out. People not quite looking at each other because everyone was either starting something long or ending something longer, and neither group particularly wanted the interaction. Daniel stood next to his car. Chevrolet Malibu 2010, color that the registration called Atlantic Blue Metallic and that most people just called grayish, 194,000 miles. The passenger side mirror was attached with 2 strips of heavy-duty tape because a hit-and-run in the Kroger parking lot 14 months ago had taken out the original housing, and the person who did it had left nothing but a tiny paint scrape and no note. He got in, he sat. He didn't start the engine for a while, $38 in his wallet. 2110, 1531s. Rent was $1,000, due the 15th, was the 9th. His last paycheck would land in 5 to 7 business days. Unemployment assistance took a minimum of 3 weeks to process, and that was assuming no complications, no audits, No delays from the office that handled wrongful termination flags, which he had now officially generated. His daughter Zoe needed new shoes. Not urgently. She hadn't said anything about it. But 2 weeks ago, he'd seen her fold a piece of paper twice and wedge it into the toe of her left sneaker before school. And when he'd asked about it, she'd said she was fine. And she'd said it in the tone of a 7-year-old who had decided not to make something into a problem because she could see the shape of what her father was carrying. That, more than the mortgage payment, was what sat in his chest on the way out of the parking lot. He drove the long way home, through Old Fourth Ward, past the mural on the side of the building on Edgewood that had been painted and repainted so many times the layers of color underneath made ridges you could feel if you pressed your palm against them. He drove past the park where he sometimes brought Zoe on Saturday afternoons, and she would bring a book and read it on a bench while he did absolutely nothing in particular, and they both considered this an excellent use of an afternoon. His wife Alicia had loved this neighborhood. Alicia had been dead for 4 years and 3 months, and he still sometimes found himself forming the word she in his head, and then spending the next half-second deciding who he was talking about. She'd been a veterinary technician at a clinic in Decatur. She'd had opinions about dogs that he'd never entirely understood. She preferred the old ones, the stiff-jointed, gray-muzzled, slow-moving dogs that most people overlooked in the shelter. Puppies are potential, she'd told him once. Old dogs are follow-through. He'd thought about that sentence more times than he could count. She died in July, the pancreatic cancer. Diagnosis in February. 5 months, start to finish, which was both very fast and the longest 5 months he had ever experienced. Zoe had been 3. He drove through the intersection at Edgewood and Hilliard, and that's when he saw the woman. Greater Bethel AMES Church was undergoing a full restoration. Blue construction netting wrapped the upper facade. Scaffolding climbed the right side to the roofline. A long horizontal banner read, "Under renovation, God's work," continues in navy and gold letters that had started to peel at the corners. The front iron gate was propped open with a brick. The woman was sitting on the front steps. Not in a way that suggested she'd just arrived. In a way that suggested she had been there for a while and had stopped expending energy on hoping it would end soon. She was dressed like someone who'd had a plan yesterday and had it disassembled by the universe overnight. Camel-colored wool coat, the kind with structure and weight. Cream turtleneck visible at the collar. Dark slacks, unwrinkled in the legs but creased at the hip where she'd been sitting. Cognac leather ankle boots with a low heel and a pointed toe, the footwear of someone who made real decisions about what they put on their feet. Her hair was natural, had been put up at some point last night and had partially descended over the course of however many hours she'd been sitting there. She was holding a phone. The screen was off. Daniel drove past her. Then he slowed. He was already a block and a half past the church before he admitted to himself that he'd been watching her in the rearview mirror since the moment he first saw her, and that something about the specific quality of how she was sitting, not defeated, not helpless, but held together, and would a person holds themselves together when they've been holding it a long time and are starting to notice the cost had registered somewhere below his ability to reason it away. He made a U-turn. He pulled up to the iron gate and stopped. He rolled down the window. Hey, he kept his voice easy. No urgency. The tone of a man who understood that women sitting alone in front of churches at 7 a.m. had every right to be skeptical of a strange vehicle pulling up. "Are you okay?" She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, not the warm amber kind. The specific dark brown that had depth to it, that caught light and held it instead of throwing it back. They were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I'm fine. Thank you, your phone looks dead." She looked down at the black screen in her palm like she'd briefly forgotten it was there. "It is. Do you need to make a call?" "I have mine." She studied him. He understood this. He was a man in a work jacket with his hair not done and his shift still on him, parked in front of a church at 7 in the morning and volunteering his cell phone to a stranger. He would have studied him too. "What made you stop?" Her voice was lower than he expected, measured, like someone who chose words not at random. "You looked like you'd been there a while." "I have. What happened?" Another pause, longer. Not suspicious, more like someone doing a quick internal audit. "I ran out of gas on I-20. About 1 a.m. I called for a tow and they got me off the highway, but my wallet is in my car, which is at a service station in Lithonia, and my phone died somewhere between there and here." I walked the last mile and a half and sat down because I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't a highway median. Daniel looked at her for a moment, looked at the phone in her hand, looked at the church steps and the early morning light coming down at that particular October angle that made everything look like it was happening slightly more clearly than usual. "I can call the tow company for you," he said, "or your service station, or whoever you need." She tilted her head. "Why would you do that? Because your phone is dead and mine isn't." "That's not why," she said it without accusation. Almost like a scientist noting a discrepancy, he thought about that for a second, about what to say. About what was actually true. "My wife used to say the world runs on small things people do for each other when there's nothing in it for them," he said. "She's gone, but I still think she might have been right." Something shifted in the woman's face, slight. Not pity, she didn't look like someone who did pity easily. Something more like recognition. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife? Thank you. Can I use your phone? That's what I'm here for." He got out of the car, stayed on his side of the gate, held the phone through the bars, which was an awkward angle, but felt like the right call. She took it without making any particular thing out of the awkwardness, found the number she needed by memory, and made the call. 2 minutes, maybe 3. He stood there in the morning light listening to half a conversation about a TOA log and a service station address, and an ETA that was apparently not good news. She handed the phone back. 90 minutes, she said. "And they need the credit card on file, which is in my wallet, which is in the car. There's a phone repair place 2 streets over. They do fast charges. $8 fee. I can take you. You can juice the phone enough to give them your card number." She looked at him again, the full look, the assessment. "My car is 2 streets that way," he said, gesturing generally down Edgewood. "I'm not suggesting anything complicated. 5-minute drive. You can sit in the front seat with the door open if you want." She almost smiled. The corners of her mouth moved. The rest of her face was evaluating him, but her mouth made that small involuntary movement. "I'll sit in the front seat like a normal person," she said. "That works too." She picked up the bag at her feet, leather, structured, the kind of bag with specific pockets, and stood up. She was taller than he'd expected, and when she stood like someone who had been doing it correctly for a long time. She walked to the gate. He walked back to the car. They both got in. His car, he realized immediately, was not a space designed to impress anyone. The air freshener had died somewhere around August. The back seat had a school permission slip from 2 weeks ago that he'd meant to file. The center console held 3 lip balms that were Zoe's, a half-empty water bottle that was his, and 2 guitar picks that had belonged to Alicia, and that he could not bring himself to throw away, even though he did not play guitar. The woman settled into the passenger seat without comment, which he appreciated. They drove in silence for the first half-block. "What's your name?" she asked Daniel. "Daniel Lopez. I'm Sandra. Just Sandra?" "For now." He glanced over. She was looking out the window, watching the street. Daniel, repeating it like she was deciding something about it. "You look like a man who had a very bad morning. Is it that obvious? Your jaw has been set since I got in the car." He made a conscious effort to relax it. "I got terminated about 45 minutes ago. I'm sorry." "Yeah, what happened?" He thought about how to say it. He landed on the simplest version. "They think I stole something I didn't steal." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" she said then. He looked over. "What? You said you had the opportunity. You clearly needed money. Why didn't you take it?" The question landed without judgment. She was asking it the way someone asks a question they actually want answered, not the way someone asks a question to make a point. "Because I have a 7-year-old, he said. "And someday she's going to have to do something hard. I want her to be able to do it because she watched me do it first." Sandra didn't respond. She turned to look out the front windshield for a moment. Then she said, quietly and almost to herself, "That's the best answer I've heard to that question." He didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure she was talking to him. The phone repair shop on Flat Shoals had a handwritten sign in the window that said "Fast Charge $8" and a cat asleep on the counter who regarded all human activity with the contempt it deserved. The owner knew Daniel by sight from a cracked screen incident 14 months ago. Daniel stood at the counter, held out his wallet. Sandra touched his arm. "I'll pay you back." He opened the wallet anyway. $30, $120, $110, $15, 3 ones. $8 for the charge. That left 30. He put the 8 on the counter. They waited outside on the sidewalk while they urged enough to be useful. The morning was doing what October mornings do in Atlanta, not cold exactly, but carrying a reminder that it could be. Light moving through the trees at a low slant. The sound of the city gradually adding to itself. You walked a mile and a half, Daniel said, after a while. Mile and a half, maybe two. In those boots. She looked down at her feet. I have had worse decisions. In the dark there were streetlights. He shook his head, not at her. Just at the image of it, a woman in good shoes walking an October highway median at 1 in the morning because the universe had decided that was what her Tuesday was going to include. Where were you trying to get to? Midtown. I have meetings. A pause. Had meetings. I've been rescheduling by memory since 6 a.m., which not is my preferred workflow. Is that what you call it? Workflow. I spend a lot of time managing logistics. I've been doing that for almost 3 years, Daniel said. Coordinating medical supply shipments, and now you're not, and now I'm not. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her processing something, though he couldn't identify what. Daniel. The way she said his name had a quality he couldn't quite name, like she was deciding how to hold it. What are you going to do today? Drive home. Tell my daughter something happened. Figure out the next part from there, and the next part, I'll know when I get there. She studied him for a long beat. You're not scared. I'm scared, he said. I'm just not going to solve anything by being loud about it. The phone charged enough. She made 2 calls, handled the tow company payment, arranged for her car to be taken to a dealership she'd apparently used before, without explaining how she knew which Decatur dealer to trust, and then stood at the sidewalk, looking at the phone for a moment longer than necessary. Daniel had been watching the street. Giving her room. I need one more thing, she said. He looked over. I haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon. And there's a place across the street. She nodded toward a diner with a hand-painted sign in the window. Cash only before 9 a.m. and my wallet is in Lithonia. He looked at the diner, looked at his wallet, looked at her. And here was the moment, right here. The moment between what you have and what you're willing to give away. 30 left. Rent due in 6 days. A daughter with a paper wedge in her shoe. He pulled the wallet out. He took out the 20. He didn't do it like it was a sacrifice. He did it the way you do something when you've decided it's the right thing, and you've stopped negotiating with yourself about it. She looked at the 20 like he'd handed her something more complicated than currency, Daniel. That's too much. I just need, get breakfast, get coffee, get whatever makes the next 2 hours feel less like the past 12. You just told me you lost your job. I know what I told you. She looked at the money, looked at him. Her eyes were doing something he couldn't read, not because it was hidden, but because it was too complex to catch in one look. I will pay you back, she said. I'm telling you that as a fact, not as a polite thing to say. I believe you, he said. But don't do it for that reason. She took the 20. She did it slowly, the way you take something that costs you something to receive. Sandra, he meant to say something else. He wasn't sure what. He ended up saying, take care of yourself today. She looked at him, held the look a beat longer than felt accidental. You have an honest face, she said. I don't know exactly what I mean by that, neither do I. Yes, you do, she said. Then she walked across the street to the diner and went inside. Daniel drove home with $10 in his wallet and the ghost of a conversation he couldn't stop replaying. Not the words, exactly. The quality of them. The way she'd asked, why didn't you like it, was a real question, not a rhetorical one. The way she'd registered his answer out, Zoe, like it was something she was filing somewhere. The way she'd said, you have an honest face, with the specific conviction of someone reporting a measurement. Most people, when they had something complicated to say, either said it immediately or avoided it indefinitely. She had done neither. She had identified the appropriate moment and put it in the calendar. That was either extremely professional or extremely strange. He had the feeling it might be both. The building on Fielding Avenue was 3 stories, brick exterior that had been painted over at some point and was now in the process of reverting, a small courtyard with a dying ficus in a planter, and the permanent faint suggestion of laundry detergent that came from the laundromat on the ground floor. He and Zoe had lived on the 2nd floor for 2 years. The apartment was not large. It was clean and it was theirs, and there was a bookshelf in Zoe's room that Daniel had built from pallet wood and basic hardware, and which held more books than any 7-year-old he had ever encountered. He went up the stairs. The door opened before he reached it. Zoe was standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the pandas on them. which she had informed him recently were not baby pajamas but a specific artistic choice, eating dry cereal directly from the box because they were out of milk. She did not make this into a thing. The box was open, she was hungry. The universe had failed to provide milk, and so she had adapted. She was 7 years old and she read at a 5th grade level, and she handled the absence of milk with more equanimity than most adults. Daniel knew handled far larger disruptions. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah." He hung his jacket, sat down at the kitchen table. "Come here for a second." She brought the cereal box and sat across from him. Something happened, not a question. Statement of observed fact. A couple things, bad? Some. She waited. She had learned to wait. When Alicia was sick and then gone, Zoe had been 3 years old and had sat through long, difficult silences with a patience that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with something she'd been born with. She'd sit in the hospital room and draw pictures on the backs of intake forms. She never demanded to know when things would be normal again. She still had that quality. She waited now, one hand on the cereal box, watching him with those eyes that were shaped exactly like her mother's. "I lost my job this morning," he said. "Oh, they think I did something I didn't do. It's complicated. But I wanted you to know, because things are going to be a little tight for a while." "Tighter than now?" she said, a little. She nodded. Ate a piece of cereal. "What about the shoes?" she said. He'd almost anticipated that. He almost said yes automatically. The way you do when you're protecting someone from a thing they shouldn't have to worry about. Not this week, baby girl. But soon. I promise. Okay, no reproach, no recalibration of expectations. Just okay. Then she reached across the table and put her small hand over to his. Her palm was warm from the cereal box. She smelled like the shea butter he put in her hair on Sundays. Daddy, very serious. The way she got when she was about to ask something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Did you do anything bad?" "No, promise. On everything that matters." "I didn't do anything wrong." She squeezed his hand once. "Okay," she said. "I know you didn't." She said it the way you state a thing that has already been verified. No doubt in it. No hope in it. Just fact. Daniel didn't know what to do with that. He just held her hand for a moment and let it be enough. The rest of the morning moved in the way of hard days. He made phone calls. He filed the online paperwork for unemployment benefits, which took longer than it should because the state's benefits portal had a file upload function that did not work in the browser he was using, and he spent 40 minutes identifying this problem and then finding a workaround. He sent 2 emails to former colleagues he trusted. He looked at his checking account balance 3 times, as if looking at it repeatedly might produce a different number. At noon he made Zoe a grilled cheese sandwich and ate the end pieces of bread himself and called that his lunch. At 2:15 he walked her to her afternoon program at the community center 3 blocks away, which was free, and which he said a silent and genuine thank you for every time he dropped her off. On the walk back, he stopped at the corner of Fielding and Auburn and stood in the October light and said, mostly to himself, "I just need something to go right, once. That's all I'm asking." He didn't know who he was talking to. He hadn't believed in that kind of listening in a long time. He walked home. He sat on the couch. He stared at the wall. At 4:47, his phone rang. Unknown number, Georgia's area code. He let it go. At 4:52, it rang again. He let it go. At 4:58, it rang a third time, and he picked it up because whatever this was, it was persistent, and persistent things in his experience either required immediate attention or turned into something worse for being avoided. "Hello, Daniel Lopez," the voice. Low, measured, specific. He sat. "This is Sandra." From this morning, his brain did the rapid accounting. The church steps, the camel coat, the dead phone, the $20. "How did you get this number?" "I have my ways." "That's not an answer, I know." "I'll explain tomorrow." A pause. "Are you home tomorrow morning?" "Around 9. I'm going to be home every morning for the foreseeable future. I'd like to come by, to return what I owe you. And to talk about something else." He thought about the word else. About the way she'd said she'd explain. About the fact that she'd somehow obtained his phone number from a morning during which he had never given it to her. "What's the something else?" he said. A long pause. Longer than the question warranted. "Someone who owes you more than the 20, she said. "I'll see you at 9, she hung up. Daniel held the phone against his ear for a few seconds after the call ended, listening to the silence the way you do when you're trying to decide if what just happened was real, or if you've finally drifted past exhaustion into some stranger territory. Then he set the phone on the coffee table, and he went to the window. Fielding Avenue was doing its evening routine. The laundromat's fluorescent glow hitting the sidewalk in a wide rectangle. A couple walking a dog, the bodega across the street pulling its awning in. Somewhere a block over, a car alarm that no one was moving to address. He stood there for a long time, thinking about Ronald Sanchez's hand going to his collar, thinking about George White's eyes when he pushed the paper across the desk, thinking about a woman in a camel coat who had said, "You have an honest face," like she was reading a diagnostic. He did not sleep, not in any real sense. He lay in the dark and did the thing that passed for sleep, when your brain refused to stop working, the shallow drift where you're aware of the ceiling and aware of your own breathing and aware that time is passing, but you're not actually resting inside any of it. The water stain above his bed had a shape. He'd never looked at it long enough to decide what the shape was. Tonight he looked at it long enough that it became in sequence, the state of Georgia, then a dog, then the outline of Ronald Sanchez's face with that particular expression he'd worn in the doorway of the break room. At 2:47 in the morning he got up. The kitchen floor was cold through his socks. He filled the kettle. While he waited for the water, he stood at the window and watched the alley behind the building, which was empty except for a raccoon, conducting a methodical investigation of the dumpster near the laundromat's back door. The raccoon was thorough, unhurried, completely confident that the dumpster would eventually yield something worthwhile. Daniel found this oddly encouraging. The kettle clicked. He poured. He had one tea bag left and he'd already used it once, which was a thing he'd started doing 3 weeks ago without fully acknowledging it as a new economy. 1 bag, 2 cups. Alicia would have laughed at him. She'd have said something exact and affectionate about it. He couldn't reconstruct the specific sentence, but he knew the feeling of it. The warmth of being known well enough to be teased correctly. He carried the tea to the couch and sat in the dark and thought about Sandra Anderson's voice on the phone. The precision of it. "I'll explain tomorrow." Like explanation was a thing you scheduled. Like she'd done the calculus on what could be said over a phone line versus what required physical presence and had made a decision accordingly. At 4:22 his phone buzzed. Not a call, a text from a number he didn't have saved. He typed at it back. No. Then? Neither. Normal when something's about to change. He read that twice. Set the phone face down, picked it up again, typed, "How do you know something's about to change?" The reply came fast. "Because I'm about to change it." He put the phone down and not pick it up again then and sat in the dark with his tea getting cold and thought about what kind of person sends a text like that at 4 in the morning. The answer he kept arriving at was, someone who means it. He got Zoe ready for school with the particular focused efficiency of a man who had decided that the best way to handle not knowing what was coming was to execute the known things as well as possible. Toast with the last of the peanut butter. Hair in 2 puffs because she'd decided braids were for Wednesdays now. And this was Thursday. Backpack check reading log signed, permission slip that he'd found on the back seat of the car yesterday and should have signed 2 days ago, now signed. Left sneakers checked for the paper wedge. Still there, he did not remove it. He pretended not to see it. Because if he removed it, she would know he'd noticed. And if she knew he'd noticed, she'd feel something she shouldn't have to feel. And he was not going to put that on her on a Thursday morning before school. Does Jackson met them at the corner of Fielding and Auburn at 7:45. Donna was 62 years old, small, compact, with a face that had been beautiful in a way that had simply restructured itself into something more interesting over the decades. She was in her red coat, the one that had seen 4 winters, and was starting to show them, and a scarf that Alicia had knitted for her the winter before the diagnosis. That scarf appeared every October without fail. It was the color of dried flowers. Daniel had never been able to look at it for very long. Donna opened her arms when Zoe was still half a block away. Zoe ran the last 20 feet. Which was also something she did every morning, and which Daniel had long since stopped trying to make sense of, because some things were just part of the structure of a day and you didn't interrogate them. "You look terrible," Donna told him, over Zoe's head. "Good morning to you too. Did you eat?" "I had tea. That's not eating. It's a liquid." She gave him the look that Alicia had inherited from her and that Zoe was in the process of developing. 3 generations of a specific expression that communicated, with remarkable economy, the opinion that whatever he was doing was insufficient, Pick her up at 5, Donna said, and turned Zoe toward the crosswalk, and that was that. He walked home. The morning was doing something complicated with the light. October in Atlanta had its own particular quality, warmer than most people expected from October, but with an angle to the sun that said winter was forming plans. The trees on Auburn had dropped about a third of their leaves, which were collecting in the gutters in the specific, undramatic way of leaves that have simply run out of reasons to stay attached. He got back to the apartment at 8:23. He made his bed. He hadn't made it in. He didn't want to do the count. He wiped it down the kitchen counter. He put away the 3 dishes from the drying rack. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked at it the way a stranger would, trying to see what Sandra Anderson would see when she walked through that door. The couch sagged in the left cushion. The bookshelf he'd built from pallet wood was level but clearly homemade. The lamp by the window was from a church sale and had a small dent in the base that he'd turned toward the wall. The walls themselves were mostly bare except for a framed photo of Zoe at age 4 standing at the edge of a fountain, arms wide, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the universe is magnificent. And above the small table by the window, the photo of Alicia. Stone Mountain, summer before Zoe was born, wind in her hair, laughing at something that had happened just outside the frame. She looked the way she always looked in photos taken by people who didn't know they were taking them entirely herself. Unperformed, Daniel looked at it for a moment. Then he heard the car, a single black SUV, was parked on Fielding Avenue. Clean, big. The kind of vehicle that was built to project a specific kind of presence. One man was getting out of the driver's side, broad, bald, dark suit. The build of someone who had been athletic professionally before this job required a different kind of discipline. And from the back seat, Sandra Anderson. Different from yesterday, completely different. Yesterday she'd been a woman who'd survived an unplanned night outside. Today she wore a suit the color of heavy cream, structured blazer with shoulder detail, wide-leg trousers that broke perfectly at the ankle. Beneath it a silk blouse in deep amber that caught the morning light when she moved. Her hair was up, pinned close, a few gold clips visible at the fold. Cognac boots, different pair, higher heel, the same deliberate exactness. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building. The large man stood slightly behind and to her left, which was not the position of a person who was with her. It was the position of a person assigned to her. Daniel let the curtain fall. He stood in the middle of his living room, holding absolutely nothing, which somehow felt like the wrong thing to be doing. He went to the counter. He put the kettle on. He stood there waiting for the knock, 3 knocks, spaced, deliberate. The kind of knock that announces itself without apology. He opened the door. The large man in the hall had a Bluetooth earpiece and the expression of someone who had been paid to have no expression. Mr. Lopez, I'm Brian Thompson. I work for Ms. Anderson. She's asking if you'd be willing to come down to speak with her. She doesn't want to come up. She didn't indicate a preference, sir. She asked me to ask. Daniel looked past him down the stairwell. Looked back. She could just come up. I can relay that, or... Daniel grabbed his keys off the hook. I'll come down. Brian Thompson stepped up with the efficiency of a man who had calculated where all the furniture was before he entered the hallway. On the sidewalk, Sandra was standing in front of the SUV. She'd known he was coming down. She'd been watching the building's entrance. When he pushed through the outer door, she didn't look surprised. She looked like she'd been having a private conversation with herself and had just reached a conclusion. Thank you for coming down, she said. You have a security detail. I have Brian. Brian is a security detail. Brian is Brian. He has opinions about this, but he's professional enough not to share them in front of you. Beat, usually. From 10 feet away, Brian Thompson did not react, which was itself a reaction. Sandra, Daniel stopped on the sidewalk. Morning traffic, moving behind him. Fielding Avenue going about its life completely indifferent to whatever this was. Who are you? She looked at him for a moment. Long enough that he understood she was deciding how to do this. My full name is Sandra Anderson. I run a company called Ashford Anderson Logistics International. Freight forwarding, medical supply chains, agricultural equipment distribution, high-value industrial materials. 38 countries. About 18,000 employees. The number sat in the air between them. Okay, Daniel said. Okay, I heard you. I'm processing. She almost smiled. That's a reasonable response on your company. He was working through it in real time. Ashford Anderson Logistics, yes. That's a temp holding company it is, which has subsidiaries. Correct, one of those subsidiaries is Meridian Supply Group. Her expression shifted. Just enough. Yes. You own the company that fired me. My company owns the company that fired you. That's splitting a hair so thin it's basically invisible. Perhaps he looked at her, at the cream suit, at Brian Thompson, who had found something extremely interesting to observe in the middle distance. At the SUV, which he now noticed had tinted rear windows heavy enough to suggest it wasn't the only feature reinforced. When you were on those church steps yesterday. Measured. Careful. You knew I worked there. I knew there had been a termination at Meridian that morning. I didn't know it was you specifically until you mentioned working in supply chain logistics, at which point I began to suspect. I confirmed it later in the day, before you called me, before I called you. So when you called me, you already knew. Yes, something moved through his chest. Not anger exactly. More like the recalibration you do when you realize the map you've been reading was drawn to a different scale than you thought. You weren't stranded, he said. My car genuinely ran out of gas, but you chose those church steps. On purpose, a pause, yes, because the church is near the Meridian facility, 1.5 miles. I've been observing that area for 6 weeks, and then I drove past, and then you stopped, which you didn't expect. I had stopped expecting anything in particular from that location. Yes, he turned to look out the window. Atlanta moving past since October, register the neighborhood shifting from residential to commercial. Give me 2 minutes, he said. He went back upstairs, turned off the kettle, changed his shirt, the blue flannel that had belonged to Alicia's father, the one he wore when he needed to feel like something solid was close. He looked in the bathroom mirror. He'd needed a haircut for 6 weeks and still needed one. Nothing had changed about that. He went back down. He got in the car. Brian drove. Sandra sat beside Daniel in the back. The SUV's interior smelled like leather and climate control, and the faint trace of coffee from a travel mug in the front cup holder. The seats were the kind of comfortable that you noticed because you'd never been in a vehicle that prioritized that specific quality to this extent. You're going to tell me now, Daniel said. I'm going to tell you on the way. We're on the way. She turned to face him slightly, not fully, like she was deciding how much of herself to aim at this conversation. For the past 5 months, I've been visiting cities where Ashford Anderson operates, without announcing myself, without my usual team. I sit in places where people who work for my company exist when they're not at work. Bus stops, diners, parking lots at shift change. I'm trying to see who the people who work for me actually are. Because something is wrong inside the company and I cannot trust the data I'm receiving from the top of the organization. Something wrong how? Shipments going missing. Not randomly, specifically, consistently. On a schedule that doesn't match any normal variance pattern. How long? 15 months, as far as we can track. Possibly longer with less traceable volume. He was doing math he didn't want to do. 15 months. Medical supply chains. Facilities serving communities where there was no budget for redundancy. What was in the Crestview Health shipment, he said. The 16 crates. She looked at him. I helped load that truck. I know what was on the manifest generally. I'm asking specifically, surgical equipment, respiratory support materials, a quantity of specialty pharmaceuticals for a pediatric unit, a beat. The Crestview Health facility in Columbus serves a population that does not have other options in a 50-mile radius. He was quiet. So was she. The silence held something that didn't need to be named. You chose the church steps, he said eventually. It's a 1.5 blocks from the Meridian rear gate. I'd been watching shift changes for 3 weeks, and then I drove past, and then you stopped, which you didn't expect. I had stopped expecting anything in particular from that location. Yes. He turned to look out the window. Atlanta moving past. You gave me $20, Sandra said. You had $38 total. I had 30 when I left you. I spent 8 on the phone charge. You gave me 20 of the 30 you had left. On the worst morning you'd had in a long time. It was $20. It was 2/3 of what you had. I was then calculating fractions. I know you weren't. That's the thing I couldn't stop thinking about. He looked at her then. Actually looked. She was watching him with an expression he'd started to be able to read. Slightly the particular quality her face got when she was stating something she had verified thoroughly before saying it aloud. You gave it away, she said, because that's who you are. And a man who is who you are on the worst morning of his life did not move 16 crates of pediatric pharmaceuticals off a loading dock for personal gain. That's not a feeling. That's an operational assessment of human behavior. You sound like you've been working on that sentence since approximately 2 a.m. The facility was in College Park, Industrial Park, no signage from the road. A low brick building behind a line of pine trees that had grown tall enough to make the building invisible until you were in the parking lot. No logo. Just a number on the gatepost and a keypad at the entrance. Inside, clean, bright, busy in a quiet way. 30 or so people at various desks, multiple monitors, the low-frequency energy of focused work. Nobody looked up when Sandra walked in. Not pointedly, it wasn't performed indifference. They simply didn't stop because stopping wasn't in the culture. Deborah White came to meet them. She moved the way people move when their time has value and they've stopped pretending otherwise. 45, maybe, though she carried her age like it was a credential. Dark suit, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of presence that took up more room than her physical space warranted. She shook Daniel's hand once, firm, not an evaluation, just a greeting that meant what it was. Deborah runs our internal compliance operation, Sandra said. You'll work directly with her. Work, Daniel said. I'm getting there. Sandra gestured toward a hallway. Come see the room first. The room was small, no windows. 3 monitors, a whiteboard covered in blue marker dates, arrows, names, account numbers, weight variances, in a column that went on longer than felt comfortable to look at, and in the lower right corner of the whiteboard, circled once in red, Daniel Lup's set up 10-9. He stood at the threshold for a moment, not because he was surprised, because seeing your own name on a board that size, in that context, in that handwriting that was not your own, had a specific weight to it that he needed a second to absorb. Sit down, Deborah said from behind him. It wasn't unkind. It was just the voice of someone who had learned that the people who needed to sit down rarely sat down until someone told them to. He sat in the chair. Bad chair. He noticed the way the left rear leg had been repaired with a bolt that didn't quite match the frame. What you're looking at, Deborah said, pulling up a file on the center monitor, is 15 months of dispatch records from the Meridian Atlanta facility. Every shipment. Loading manifest weight versus first weigh station reading on I-20. The variance column, he looked at it. He couldn't help it, his went to the numbers automatically, the way it always went to numbers on a manifest, looking for the pattern before he'd consciously decided to look. Most variances were small, under 40 pounds, normal packing shift, but some weren't. The outliers, he said. Look at the dates. He looked at the dates. 4 seconds, Tuesday nights, he said. Tuesday nights. Between 10 p.m. and midnight. Consistently, that's Ronald Sanchez's closing shift. Deborah's expression didn't change. She pulled up the camera footage. .4. Tuesday, if 11:55 p.m. Daniel watched himself on the monitor moving crates, signing out, doing exactly the job he'd been hired to do. Then Deborah advanced the timestamp. 11:55:14, a shape in the shadow behind the number 3 forklift. 3 seconds, the dock lights caught something at chest level, a glint, a thin line, a key on a cord. Play that again, Daniel said. She played it again. He leaned forward. That's Ronald Sanchez. You're certain, the lanyard. He keeps his cold storage key inside his shirt. I've seen it enough times to know the length of the cord and where the key sits on it. When I mentioned it to him on my way out yesterday morning, he reached for it before he realized he was doing it. He sat back. That's him. Deborah wrote something on the whiteboard without looking at what she wrote. That specific kind of muscle memory. She spent 2 hours walking him through it. 3 people. A structure, Ronald Sanchez at the dock level, the physical operation, the actual movement of product. Roughly 780,000 over 15 months, distributed through 3 different accounts, 2 of which were under names that didn't correspond to any employee in the system. Laura Clark. Corporate accounts, Charlotte office, the paperwork, architecture, ghost manifests. A shell company in Nashville with a registered agent and no activity. A secondary shell in Delaware that existed for exactly this purpose. Product ending at a private warehouse in Birmingham, Alabama, where it was broken down and moved through 3 separate gray market medical supply channels. She'd received approximately $380,000, and Edward Harris, chief operating officer of the entire group, 58 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, or the residual build of someone who'd been an exceptional athlete decades ago. He wore white or off-white suits on significant days. Sandra mentioned this once, briefly, and Daniel filed it without knowing yet why it mattered. Harris had designed the internal compliance reporting structure 2 years before the operation began. He'd made it specific enough to catch small infractions and broad enough to route any material concern through so many layers of review that it effectively disappeared. He'd built the ceiling on purpose and then stood just under it. He had received the rest. Daniel sat with that for a moment, and above Harris, he said. Deborah paused. "We believe there's a board-level participant. Someone who signed off at the authorization point 3 years ago when this was being structured. We don't have that name yet, but you think it exists. We think Harris didn't do this alone. Harris is competent. He's not the kind of man who originates a structure this sophisticated without someone above him providing cover." Daniel looked at the whiteboard, at the circle around his name, at the arrows connecting it to Ronald Sanchez's name and to Timothy Clark's name. Clark, the regional director, the middleman who'd said nothing and received $190. Susan for the saying of nothing. "Why me?" he said. Not rhetorically. Out of everyone in that building, why was I the one they chose? Deborah said something then that he hadn't expected. She said, "Because Ronald Sanchez believed you were the kind of man no one would fight for." The room was quiet for a moment. "He was wrong," she added. Not warmly. Just as a correction, the offer came at the end of the second hour. Sandra laid it out the same way she laid everything out, without preamble, without softening, in the exact terms it actually existed in. A 6-month contract, renewable. Salary equivalent to a senior compliance associate, $84,000 annualized, plus a settlement for the wrongful termination. Her legal team's estimate of what a lawsuit would cost after fees on both sides. $60,000 paid this week. Daniel looked at the number. Looked at her. "That's not generosity," she said. "That's arithmetic. It's what I'd spend defending a suit. This is cleaner. Everything with you is arithmetic. Most things. What isn't?" A pause. Brief but deliberate. "I'll have to get back to you on that." Which was the second time she'd said something that he couldn't figure out what to do with. He signed the paperwork where Deborah pointed. The NDA was 14 pages. The contract was 8. The settlement agreement had a check attached with a paperclip physical check, already printed. $60,000, his name spelled correctly. He stared at it for a moment that was longer than he intended. "Deposit it today," Deborah said. "Don't carry it around, right? And the chair is bad." "I know the chair is bad. We've been trying to get a replacement through procurement for 2 months. I apologize for the chair in advance. I've sat in worse chairs for 12 hours at a time." She looked at him then. A brief recalibration. "Yes, you have. That's part of why you're here." He worked for the rest of that first day and most of the second, Weddell variances. Badge swipe logs, GPS pings from the trailer fleet, thermostat readings from the cold storage units that told you, if you knew how to read them, when a door had been opened at out of scheduled access windows. The warehouse generated a staggering volume of data. You could write a detailed account of any given Tuesday night from raw logs alone, who entered which door at what time, which vehicle left which bay, which key accessed which lock and for how long. What the data couldn't tell you was what you knew from 2 years and 9 months of standing on that dock. Daniel knew which bay door had a sticky hydraulic seal that took 4 seconds longer to close than the others. He knew the forklift in Bay 3 had a wheel-bearing issue that made it list slightly left and left a distinctive track in the painted concrete. He knew that the camera covering the northeast corner of Dock 4 had a 12-degree blind spot that the facilities team had been meaning to correct since January. He wrote 3 pages of notes on his second afternoon. Deborah read them that evening and came back with a look that said she had upgraded her assessment. He got home every day before 5. Sandra had built it into the structure, the way she built things that mattered into structures without making them into conversations. A car came for him at 4:30. Anthony Wilson drove. Anthony drove with both hands on the wheel, radio off, and the settled quality of a man who had found the correct settings for his life and had no interest in adjusting them. Daniel appreciated this more each day. On the Friday of the first week, the settlement check cleared. He drove to the mall on his way to pick up Zoe. He found the shoe section. He stood in front of a wall of options for 3 minutes deciding, which was 2 minutes and 50 seconds longer than he usually spent deciding things. And then he bought the brown boots with the soft lining that she'd lingered on twice in a catalog 3 months ago, and said nothing about. He bought them 2 sizes up, so she'd grow into them. He also bought her a winter coat she hadn't asked for, and a pair of gloves that she actually needed. He put the bag on the kitchen table when they got home. She came out of her room and saw it and walked toward it with the specific, careful step of someone who doesn't want to disturb a thing in case it isn't real. She opened it. She looked at the boots for a long moment. She didn't squeal. Zoe was not a squealing person. She just said very quietly, "Can I put them on right now, even inside? Put them on right now." She sat on the linoleum and laced them with focused hands, and then stood up and walked around the kitchen for 10 minutes without saying anything at all. Just walking, like the boots were an experience she needed to have in silence. Daniel stood at the sink and cleaned a bowl that was already clean. Zoe walked around that kitchen in her new boots for a long time, not saying anything, just walking. And the sound of each step on the linoleum was the sound of something restored that Daniel hadn't had language for until he heard it. The grey Camry appeared on a Tuesday. He noticed it the second morning, same spot, across from the building entrance, same time. The dent in the passenger door was distinctive, a long horizontal scrape that had been there long enough to rust at the edges. He told himself he was reading too much into it. He told Deborah on Thursday anyway, because she'd told him to report things even when he thought he was reading too much into them. She did not say he was being paranoid. She picked up her desk phone, dialed an extension and said, "Pull the plate on a grey Camry, recent model, that's been sitting on Fielding Avenue near Lopez's building the past 2 mornings. Then she calmly finished the thought she'd been developing with Daniel about the cold storage access logs. Her phone rang 90 seconds later. She listened, nodded once. Up, leased through a company in Decatur, she said. They sublet to a private investigator named Gary Young, freelance. The kind of work he usually does involves domestic disputes and insurance fraud. She paused. Ronald Sanchez retained him 6 days ago. The room had a particular quality when Deborah delivered information. No inflation, no drama, just facts arriving in the order they needed to arrive in. Sanchez thinks I'm a problem, Daniel said. Sanchez thinks you're a loose end. There's a difference. A problem implies capability. A loose end implies only that you exist and might fray. She looked at him. He underestimated both categories. What do we do about Young? We let him watch. He'll see you take your daughter to school. He'll see you come home. He'll see a man trying to stabilize after a job loss, which is what you are, which is also, conveniently, exactly what Sanchez wants to see. A brief pause. In the meantime, I'll put someone on Young, and on everyone Young reports to, and we'll follow the money from the other direction. She looked at him directly. Do you own a firearm? No. Do you want one? No. Good. I was going to say no anyway. There will be someone on your street at night for a while. You won't see them. They won't knock on your door. They'll be there. Is that all right with you? Yes. That night, for the first time, Daniel didn't notice the Camry on his way home because he was looking for it instead of just noticing it. And looking for a thing and noticing a thing turned out to be completely different skills. The binder of photographs on the whiteboard grew through the second week. Ronald Sanchez from a grainy security still in the facility parking lot. Timothy Clark from a group photo taken at a regional managers conference the previous spring. Laura Clark from her corporate ID, which Deborah's team had pulled through channels Daniel decided not to ask about. And a 4th photograph added on Thursday, Edward Harris. From a business magazine feature that had run 8 months ago, he was in a white suit in the photo. Standing in front of the Ashford Anderson headquarters building with the expression of a man who considered himself the reason the building existed. Below the photo, in Deborah's handwriting, a single notation, designed internal compliance structure 36 months ago. Modified reporting thresholds twice since. Both modifications had the effect of reducing upward visibility on variance anomalies under $400K per quarter. Daniel looked at that line for a long time. The man had built the walls of his own protection using the tools of the institution he was robbing. He'd made it so that the people most likely to see what he was doing were the people least likely to have a channel through which their seeing could reach anyone who would act. And when a variable appeared that he hadn't accounted for, a dock worker with a good memory for numbers who'd been in the wrong place, at the wrong time, he'd had Ronald Sanchez erase it. Daniel thought about that word, erase. About how close it had come to working, Deborah came in around 3 on that Thursday afternoon and found him still looking at the Harris photograph. "You look upset," she said. "I'm thinking about the structure he built. What about it?" He made it so that anyone below a certain level who noticed something wrong would get ground up before the information could reach someone with the authority to act. He built the mechanism of his own protection using institutional trust. Deborah sat on the edge of the desk. She took her reading glasses off their chain and held them, not mopping them on, just holding them. "Daniel, yeah, that is going to happen whether you help us or not. The only thing your work changes is how soon it ends and how cleanly. If it ends as now through a careful legal process, it ends with a minimum of secondary damage. If it runs another 4 months through the courts, it runs 2 more shipment cycles, more facilities, more shortages, more people at the bottom of the supply chain absorbing losses they can't absorb." She paused. "I'm not telling you to feel good about it. I'm telling you to keep working." She stood up, started to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "the fact that it bothers you is why she picked you." He looked up. "Who?" Deborah looked at him with the expression of a woman who did not have time for rhetorical questions. Then she left. The third Monday, just past 4 in the afternoon, Daniel had been staring at the whiteboard for 45 minutes, not thinking, just looking. The door behind him opened. He assumed Deborah. "I'll have the clerk summary by morning." "It's not Deborah, Sandra?" She was in the doorway in dark slacks and a deep plum sweater, hair loose, boots with a lower heel than usual. She looked like someone who had finished a long day and decided to end it differently than she'd been planning. No briefcase, no folder, just her. "Are you almost done?" she said. "I can be, then finish. I'll wait." She came into the room and stood behind him looking at the whiteboard while he closed the files and shut down the monitors. Nobody had ever stood behind him while he worked before. He became suddenly and specifically aware of his own posture. "You've added more than I expected," she said, still looking at the board. "Deborah did the major additions. Deborah's handwriting is significantly worse than that. At least half of this is yours." He hadn't thought she'd noticed. "Walk with me," she said. The gravel path around the building ran through the pine trees and opened briefly to a view of the western sky, which at 5:15 in October was doing the specific thing that October skies do, going from blue to something darker and more considered, with one star already showing above the tree line like an advance scout. They walked side by side. "Not particularly close. Not particularly far. How's Zoe?" she said. "Good. She has new boots." Good pause up. "Daniel, yeah, I came out here to ask you something, and if the answer is no, nothing changes. The contract holds. You keep working, ask." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They were at the bend in the path where the pines thinned enough to see the ridge beyond the facility perimeter. Wind moved through the trees with that particular sound that only happens when the temperature starts to think about dropping. "I need you to go see Timothy Clark," she said. With a recording device, he absorbed that. "What's the scenario? You approach him as a man at the end of his options. You tell him you have records, paper trail, weight tickets, access logs, documentation that points in a specific direction. You tell him you want to disappear. You tell him $60,000 would accomplish that. That's extortion. It's not. Entrapment requires government involvement in the inducement of a crime the person wouldn't otherwise have committed. I'm not the government. And Timothy Clark has already committed multiple crimes. We're creating an opportunity for him to confirm one of them on audio. You want me to wear a wire. I want you to wear a wire." He looked at her. She was looking at the ridge. Her hands were in her jacket pockets and her shoulders were set against the wind in a way of someone who had learned to stand steadily in weather without making it into a statement. "I've never done anything like this, I know. I'm a logistics worker. I don't know how to talk to a man like that. You don't have to be clever. You have to be exactly what you are, or a person who's been pushed past the point where principle feels affordable. The performance isn't a performance. It's the truth with one adjustment. The adjustment is that you're willing to take money to stay quiet. Everything else is exactly you." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about Ronald Sanchez's hand going to his collar. Thinking about the specific quality of George White's eyes when he looked at the desk instead of at Daniel. Thinking about the weight manifests for the Crestview Health shipment and what was on them. "Why me specifically?" he said. "You have a compliance team. You have legal. Why does it have to be me? Because Timothy Clark has already decided what kind of man you are. He's decided you're the kind of man who will eventually take what he's offered. Her voice was even. Matter of fact, he's wrong, but his being wrong about that is the mechanism. His certainty is the door, and if it goes wrong, you walk out of his office and we proceed through the courts, which we can do, which will take 4 additional months and at least 2 more shipment cycles. She finally turned to look at him. I'm not asking you to do this because it's the only way. I'm asking because it's the fastest way, and the fastest way keeps pediatric supply lines from missing another cycle. He looked at her, she looked back, and there was something in that moment in the specific quality of her looking directly at him, without flinching, without managing the moment, without deploying any of the mechanisms he'd started to notice she used when she wanted to keep a certain distance between the work and the person doing it that landed somewhere below argument. What's the panic word, he said. You choose it. He thought for a moment. Macon. Why Macon? Because I'd have no reason to say it in a conversation with Clark, and because it's the first city on the list of facilities that lost product. I want to say it if I need to and remember why it matters. She was quiet, breathing something out that she'd been holding. If you say Macon, we come through the door. A pause. Daniel, yeah, thank you for being willing. Whatever happens next, don't thank me yet. I'm thanking you for this part. The next part is its own thing. They stood there at the bend in the path for a moment longer, wind through the pines, the ridge going from visible to silhouetted as the sky deepened. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something that might have been a hawk riding the last thermal of the afternoon. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What does this cost you? Not the money. The thing that actually costs you. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. My father built this company, she said. He was not a man who asked too many questions about the methods of the men who worked it for him. He built things quickly and he didn't investigate the corners. A pause. I inherited a company with a reputation for results and a reputation for a certain amount of willingness to look the other way. I've spent 6 years trying to change that, and I'm standing here on a gravel path in the dark talking to a man who was set up because my compliance architecture made it easy, which means the thing that costs me is this. Knowing that the problem isn't just Edward Harris. The problem is the years when I let Edward Harris have enough room to become Edward Harris. He didn't say anything for a moment then. You were 24. I was 24. And I know what that means. It means it's an explanation. It doesn't mean it's absolution. The difference between those two things, he said, is something most people can't hold in their head at the same time. She looked at him. Alicia taught me that, he said. The distinction. She was very precise about the difference between understanding why a thing happened and deciding that the why made the thing okay. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you, he said. She would have also found you extremely funny without telling you why, which she did with people she respected. The corner of Sandra's mouth did something. Not quite a smile. The preparation for one. I think I would have wanted to know that, she said. And then, because neither of them knew what the next correct thing was and the wind was picking up, they walked back. The meeting with Timothy Clark was scheduled for Thursday. The briefings happened Wednesday and Thursday morning. Eric King, the audio technician, 28 years old, always in the same army green hoodie, with the patient hands of someone who worked in millimeters, fitted the recording device to Daniel's chest in the parking structure, 2 blocks from Clark's building. He smoothed the edges with a tool that looked like a dental instrument. Itchy? Eric said. Like wearing someone else's problem, Eric almost smiled. They all say something like that. Different words, same energy, he adjusted the tape margin. You know what I'm going to tell you now. Don't reach over my head. Don't adjust my shirt. Don't put my hand in my left pocket. And if I need to end it, I say Macon. And then you walk out. Don't run. Don't look back. Don't say anything else after the word. Eric stepped back, checked his work, nodded once. The device picks up everything within about 15 feet, so don't worry about volume. Just talk like you're talking, Eric, yeah. The people you've done this before, fair? Eric paused. They were okay, he said. Everyone, Daniel believed him. Or he decided to, which was close enough for what he needed. Timothy Clark's office was on the 31st floor of a building in Buckhead that had a lobby so clean it made Daniel aware of his own footsteps in a way that lobbies should not do to people. The receptionist told him to go up. The elevator took forever. He watched the floor numbers increment with the focused attention of a man who has decided that external things require his complete concentration because internal things are already handling themselves. Of 31st floor. The hallway had framed photographs of facilities, trucks, distribution centers, aerial views of the kind of infrastructure that looks efficient and impersonal from above and is made entirely of individual human decisions at ground level. Clark met him at the elevator. He was shorter than Daniel expected, broader in the shoulders than in the face, a navy suit over a white shirt, no tie, the calculation of a man who had decided he was the requirement without quite being above wanting you to notice. His smile was the professional kind, wide enough to register, not wide enough to mean anything, Daniel. Good to finally connect in person. Come on back. The handshake was brief and practiced, soft, the hand of a man who gestured at things rather than moved them. Daniel followed him down the hallway, and here it was. The thing Deborah had told him 7 times over 2 days of preparation. Let him lead. Let him establish the atmosphere. Let him feel like he's controlling the terms. Because men like Timothy Clark were most useful when they felt most comfortable, and men like Timothy Clark felt most comfortable when they felt like the smartest person setting the pace. Daniel walked half a step behind. He let his hands stay slightly open at his sides. He made his face do the thing it needed to do, which wasn't performance, it was the actual lived face of a man who had been pushed to the edge of what he knew how to do and was taking a step he would not have taken 3 weeks ago. Because that was exactly what he was. Clark's office was a corner space with 2 window walls and a desk that had been selected to communicate something specific about the man who sat behind it. The view behind him was Atlanta to the south and west, the airport visible on clear days. Today slightly hazy, but the scale of the city readable in the grid of it. Daniel sat down without being invited, which he'd decided to do, because a man with nothing left to lose doesn't wait to be invited. I appreciate you seeing me, he said. Of course, Clark settled into his chair. You had a rough situation, Daniel. I want you to know from where I sit, that was not the outcome any of us hoped for. The warmth in Clark's voice had a specific quality, the quality of something that had been warmed by a microwave rather than a fire. Sufficient temperature. No actual heat. I've been going over things, Daniel said. He let his hands rest on his knees. Slightly tense, let his jaw do what it was going to do anyway. Every night. The manifests, the schedules. I have a strong memory for numbers, that's a good skill. It's a good skill when everything adds up, a pause. It's a different thing when it doesn't. Clark's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes did. Very small. The adjustment of a memory really swung from comfortable to alert without wanting to show the transition. What do you mean by that? And Daniel told him, not everything, not all at once. The way a man tells it who has been sitting on it for 3 weeks and is only partly sure what he's decided to do. The weight variances he'd noticed over time. The dates that clustered. A friend at a station who'd shared some records informally because they'd worked together years ago and still talked. The pattern that emerged when he laid it out. I'm not trying to cause problems, Daniel said. His voice did something that wasn't planned. It dropped slightly, went quieter. The voice of a man ashamed of what he was about to ask and asking it anyway because he had no other move. I have a daughter. Her mother's gone. I need to start over somewhere that isn't here. And if I had $60,000, I would lose everything for and I would never say any of this to anyone, ever. That's all I'm asking. Clark looked at him for a long time. Daniel looked back. And then Clark smiled. Not the professional smile. Something different, smaller, narrower. The smile of a man who has decided he's looking at something manageable. 60,000 is a specific number, Clark said. It's a specific problem. I can't write you a check from this company. That's not how this works. I know how checks work. I'm not asking for a check. Then what are you asking for? I'm asking for a man like you to know how to get $60,000 to a man like me without anybody seeing the line between us. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. And you think I have that capability, Clark said. I think you've moved numbers before, in ways that aren't in the standard reports. Something crossed Clark's face. Single muscle along his jaw. The recalibration of a man who had just heard himself described accurately and was deciding how to respond to the accuracy. Let me ask you something, Daniel. Okay, who sent you? Nobody sent me. Somebody sent you. You're a dock worker. You don't walk into my office with a number and a proposition structured like this on your own. I have a 7-year-old and no income. I walked in here because I'm out of other moves. Clark studied him, doing the math. And Daniel could see the exact moment the calculation tipped. The moment Clark decided that what he was looking at was a desperate man rather than a trap. Because Clark was the kind of man who believed that everyone, eventually, had a price, and that belief made desperate men legible to him in a way that other things weren't. That belief, that specific self-consuming blindness. Was the door what I could do, Clark said slowly, is put you in contact with someone who handles certain financial arrangements privately. This person isn't affiliated with the company. The money would move in a way that can't be connected to either of us. Do you understand what I'm describing? I understand, and the records you have, gone, all of it. I'd sign whatever you want on my way out, and you wouldn't surface again. I want to leave Atlanta, Mr. Clark. That's the whole point. I want to take my daughter somewhere and start clean. That's it. Clark nodded. Once, slowly, with the nod of a man closing a transaction he considers minor. Give me your number. Someone will call you within 72 hours. They'll name the location. You bring everything you have, originals only, not copies. They'll bring what you need. That's the whole exchange. And above you, Daniel said, with just enough hesitation to make it sound like the question cost him something. In all of this, how high does it go? I'm asking because I want to know how scared to be. Clark looked at him for a moment, then he shrugged, not carelessly. The shrug of a man deciding to be magnanimous because he believed himself entirely in control of the situation. The person who structured this isn't me, Clark said. I manage a region. What happens above my region is a different level of the organization. The woman who handles the account documentation is Laura Clark, Charlotte office. She doesn't originate things. She processes what she's given, a pause. And the person who gives it is Edward Harris, CO. He set this up 3 years ago. He's been looking at trimming the Atlanta operation because Sanchez has gotten careless. That's the scope. Now you know enough to know you want to stay quiet. That's enough, Daniel said. Call you in 72 hours, Clark said. He stood up, which meant the conversation was over. Daniel stood up, walked to the door, stepped into the hallway. The elevator was on his right. He pressed the button and stood absolutely still while he waited. He watched the numbers. He kept his face the face of a man who had just made a transaction he wasn't proud of. He kept it until the lobby doors opened and he was across the marble floor and through the glass exterior doors into the Buckhead morning, which was still doing October, indifferent to what had just been recorded on a device taped to a man's chest 31 floors above. He walked to the parking structure. His car was on the second level. He got in. He closed the door. He sat for a count of 10. Then he said, quietly, to a device that was still running. Macon, in a vehicle 3 blocks south. Eric King put his headphones down on the center console, exhaled and through his nose, and 2 words into the internal chat. Complete. Clean. Daniel started the engine. His hands were shaking. They'd been shaking the entire time, he now realized. The whole conversation, the whole elevator ride, the whole walk across the lobby. He hadn't known. He'd been too focused on the next sentence to notice the shaking, which was, he thought, either the definition of being in over your head or the definition of doing something that mattered enough to override the body's complaints. He drove south on Peachtree, merged onto the connector, and somewhere around the second interchange he started laughing quietly. Just for a moment. Not because it was funny. Because the body needs somewhere to put what it can't hold anymore, and sometimes it comes out as laughter, and sometimes that's the only option that doesn't break something. Then he drove the rest of the way to the facility in College Park and went in. Sandra was already in the conference room when Daniel walked in, headphones pushed down around her neck. The recording had been playing. He could tell from the way she was sitting, not in the posture of someone who had just arrived, but in the posture of someone who had been somewhere for a while and then become very still. She stood when he came through the door. Deborah was there. Brian Thompson against the wall. Eric King at the far end of the table, laptop open, audio waveform still visible on the screen. 2 lawyers Daniel had seen around the facility but never spoken to directly. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sandra crossed the room. Not fast. Deliberately. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face the way someone looks at a thing they've been worried about and are now confirming the status of Edward Harris, she said. That's the name Clark gave. And above Harris, Clark didn't have the full board level picture. But what he confirmed on Harris is enough for the federal filing, right? She turned to the lawyers without answering. Tuesday. First filing by end of business. Get the federal contact on the phone tonight. She was already moving, the way she moved when the decision had been made, and the only remaining question was speed. Deborah, we go in before Harris knows, Clark talked. We have until Monday morning before he starts to understand what happened. Deborah was already standing. I'll need tonight and tomorrow. You'll have them. Everyone moved, except Daniel. He was still standing in the doorway with his jacket on, and his hands had stopped shaking sometime on the drive over, but now the stillness of them felt slightly unreal, like his body had used up all the available trembling and had nothing left for the aftermath. Sandra turned back. Sit down, she said, not unkind. The voice of someone who has noticed that a person is still upright when they probably shouldn't be trying so hard at that. He sat. Someone had put coffee on his side of the table. He had no idea when. He picked it up. How are you? She sat across from him. The lawyers were already filing out with their phones to their ears. Deborah had left without Daniel seeing her go, which was Deborah's particular talent, functioning. That's a clinical answer. I was wearing a wire in a Buckhead high-rise an hour ago. Clinical might be the right register. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face, not pity, not admiration. Something more complicated and less labeled than either of those. You did it well, she said. It didn't feel well. It felt like every sentence was the last one before something went wrong. That's what doing it well feels like. You stay in it anyway. He drank the coffee. It was good coffee, which he still wasn't entirely used to. There had been a brief period in the first week where he'd said something about the coffee, and she'd looked faintly offended on behalf of the coffee, as though the idea of bad coffee in a workspace was a failure of basic organizational philosophy. The envelope is in my coat pocket, he said. Give it to Brian. It's evidence. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the white envelope. $60,000 in banded hundreds. He'd held it in his hands in the parking structure of an abandoned shopping center and felt the weight of it and thought about what a person has to decide to become in order to hand that to a stranger in exchange for silence. Brian Thompson materialized from wherever Brian Thompson went when he wasn't standing against walls, took the envelope, produced a clear evidence bag from somewhere, and disappeared again. You're not keeping it, Daniel said. I know. You knew I knew. I knew you'd already made peace with it. Yes. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the coffee cup, at the audio equipment Eric was now quietly packing away across the room. Sandra, yes, Rodriguez, the board member. Clark didn't say his name. But you already knew it. She was quiet for a moment. We had a strong candidate. What Clark said on the recording confirms the architecture well enough for the federal filing to name him. When did you know, specifically? This morning. Operationally certain? 3 weeks ago, and you still needed the Clark meeting. I needed the direct confirmation on Harris that Clark provided. Rodriguez, we could reach through Harris's records once we had probable cause to compel them. She paused. The Clark meeting shortened the timeline by approximately 4 months. 4 months. More shipments. Yet he looked at her and she met it directly. The way she met most things, not deflecting, not managing the moment, just present in it. What you did today, she said, was not a small thing that I'm going to describe with small words. I'm not looking for, I know you're not. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the people who do necessary things are often the last to hear that the necessity didn't reduce the courage. He didn't know what to do with that. So he finished his coffee. And they sat there for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have just been through something together and have not yet decided what to do with the afterword. He got home at 4:47. Zoe was at Donna Jackson's. He'd texted Donna from the parking structure. Running a little late, get her dinner if she needs it. Donna had responded with a single thumbs up, which was Donna's entire text vocabulary and always felt like receiving a telegraph from a different era. The apartment was quiet in the specific way of a space that held the residue of a person, a half-finished craft project on the kitchen table, a library book face down on the couch, a drawing that had been in progress and set aside still on the floor near the window, with the crayons arranged around it in a rough circle. Zoe drew the way she did everything, with complete investment and no concern for the opinion of the medium. Daniel sat on the couch. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't pick up his phone. He sat and let the quiet be what it was. He thought about the moment in Clark's office when he'd said, "I have a 7-year-old and no income," and felt the discomfort of using true things as tools. Because they had been true. They were still true. The statement had been accurate in every fact and deployed in a context disguised to produce a particular effect. And he'd known both of those things simultaneously, and the knowing of both at once had created a friction in him that he didn't have a clean name for, that friction. The space between truth and its use. Between doing the right thing and doing the useful thing, and finding that the gap between them was narrower than you expected, and still somehow wide enough to feel. He'd talked to Alicia about that distinction once. About how a thing could be justified and still cost you something. She'd been a very concrete thinker, the kind of person who wanted the exact word, not the approximate one, and she'd said, "The cost isn't about guilt, it's about paying attention. You should feel it. Feeling it means you're still keeping track." He sat with that for a while. Then he went to get his daughter. Tuesday came in at 68 degrees and clear, which was Atlanta's way of saying that fall was not going to make any sudden moves but was thinking about it. The Ashford Anderson building was 22 floors in Midtown, glass and granite. The kind of architectural statement that had been made in the 90s and aged into respectability. Daniel had been there twice before for documentation purposes. Both times he'd been aware of the building's scale, in the way you're aware of the depth of water when you're swimming in something large. Today he was going to the 16th floor, which was where Edward Harris had his office. Brian Thompson drove. Sandra sat in the front, which she rarely did. She preferred to work in the back. But today she was watching the city through the windshield with the look of someone who had decided that the next hour required a different orientation to the world than usual. She was wearing white. Not cream, not ivory. White. A suit that caught the morning light and held its structured blazer, wide trousers, the lines of it precise in the way of something that had been made for her specifically. Beneath it a black silk blouse, which made the white red as a choice rather than a color. Gold at her ears, cognac boots, hair up, more architectural than usual, like she'd made a decision about how she wanted to arrive. Daniel had asked, on the drive over, what the white was about. She'd said, "When I want a room to know something before I say it." He hadn't pushed. He was wearing the flannel. The blue one. He hadn't brought a suit. Sandra hadn't asked him to bring a suit, which, he'd realized the night before, was itself a deliberate decision. She wanted him to look like what he was. The man from the dock. The man they'd tried to erase. Present in that room. Deborah was already in the lobby when they arrived. 2 lawyers flanked her. She was holding a leather portfolio with the practiced grip of someone who had testified in federal proceedings before, and knew that the weight of what you were carrying should show in your hands, not your face. They went up together. The 16th floor had a different quality than the floors below it. Quieter carpet, less visible activity. The kind of floor where decisions got made rather than implemented. Harris's suite was at the eastern end corner office, glass walls looking out on Midtown's roofline, and, beyond it, the faint smear of Buckhead's towers in the near distance. His assistant's desk was empty. Deborah had arranged that. A pretextual scheduling conflict had pulled her out of the suite at 8:45. She wouldn't know what had happened until she came back and found it already done. Sandra opened the door. No knock. Edward Harris was standing at the window, not sitting at his desk. Standing. Which meant he'd heard them coming. Or he'd been standing there before they arrived, or both. He was on his phone, at the left hand holding it, the right resting on the glass of the window, looking out at the city below with the posture of a man surveying something he owned, which was, Daniel thought, exactly what he believed he was doing. He was exactly what the photographs had suggested. Tall, silver-haired, structural remnants of an athlete in the set of his shoulders. The white suit today, not the cream he sometimes wore. The actual white, which meant he'd woken up this morning intending to communicate something. His cufflinks were gold. His shoes were the dark brown of a decision made by someone who understood that the details of a presentation mattered. He turned when the door opened. His face went through a very fast sequence. Sandra, recalibration, the group behind her, assessment, Daniel, whom he did not recognize, and then the settling into professional neutral that people in positions like his spent years developing. Sandra, he lowered the phone. "I wasn't expecting, I know." She walked into the room without stopping. "End the call, Edward." A beat. Then he said something quiet into the phone and set it on the desk. Daniel came in behind Sandra, Deborah behind him, then Brian, then the 2 lawyers. The room filled in a way that rooms don't often fill, not with movement or sound, but with weight. The particular weight of people who know exactly what they're doing in a space occupied by someone who has just realized he doesn't. "Who is this?" Harris said, looking at Daniel Lopez, Sandra's voice was even, not cold. Something more specific than cold, the temperature of a woman who had decided that equanimity was the most accurate expression of what she was feeling, which was not nothing. He's my deputy for field operations. I don't recognize that title. It's new. He's also the former dock supervisor at Meridian Atlanta, who your organizational structure identified as the most convenient person to frame for a theft that Ronald Sanchez committed on your behalf over 15 months across 23 facility accounts. The room was very quiet. Harris looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at him, and this was the moment Daniel had imagined, on the nights he'd lain awake since October 9th, without quite allowing himself to fully construct it. The moment of being seen by the person who had decided not to see him, who had placed him in a category dispensable, unremarkable, the kind of man who wouldn't be fought for, and built a structure of crime around that placement without ever looking directly at the placement itself. He was looking now, Mr. Harris, Daniel said. Harris said nothing. I worked on Dock 4 for 2 years and 9 months. You've never seen me before today, which is the point, a pause. You built a system that made people at my level invisible enough to use. And then when your operation needed a name on a termination notice, Ronald Sanchez looked down the list and found someone invisible enough that it would stick. I don't know what. You do. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just factual. You know exactly what I'm describing. And the part that's worth saying, because I've been thinking about how to say it for 3 weeks, is this. It wasn't personal for you. I understand that. But impersonal harm doesn't land impersonally on the person receiving it. My daughter had paper in her shoe. For 2 weeks. Because we were at the edge and then we went past it. Because you needed a name and I was available. Harris's jaw moved. Some interior calculation happening, I think. Harris said carefully that whatever you believe, Edward. Sandra's voice cut cleanly across his. Not raised. Sharper, there's a federal team in the lobby of this building. They came up in the elevator 4 minutes ago, and they're waiting on the 12th floor. They have a warrant for your records, communications, and your devices going back 38 months. She walked to his desk, stood on the other side of it. You have one option that doesn't involve walking out of this building in handcuffs, and it requires you to make a decision in the next 60 seconds. Harris looked at her. Stand up, she said. Walk away from that desk. Give me the pen. He blinked. The fountain pen, in the top left drawer. My father gave it to you when you were appointed CO. I signed that appointment. I've been thinking about that pen since I found out what you did with the authority it represented. A moment passed. Then Harris opened the drawer, took out the pen. It was a beautiful object, black barrel, gold nib, the kind of thing that was made to last a working lifetime. He held it for a second with the expression of a man looking at a version of himself he was about to stop being able to access. He set it on the desk. Sandra picked it up without touching the drawer, without touching anything else on the surface. She held it at her side. Walk out, she said. Go to the 12th floor. Everything after that is your lawyer's problem. Harry straightened his jacket. An involuntary gesture. The body doing the thing the brain has trained it to do when the self-presentation is under threat. Even when the presentation itself is about to become irrelevant. At the door, he stopped. He looked at Daniel. This wasn't personal, Harris said. I want you to understand that. And Daniel had been waiting for that sentence. Had known it was coming. Deborah had told him in the preparation sessions that men like Edward Harris, when the structure they'd built collapsed, almost always said some version of this wasn't personal, because they needed it to be true. Because the alternative that they had looked at individual human lives and calculated their disposability was a thing they couldn't assemble into a self-image they could continue to operate from. The thing about that, Daniel said, is that it only works as a defense if the people absorbing it feel it that way. My daughter didn't feel it impersonally. The parents of the kids in Columbus who didn't get their pediatric supplies didn't feel it impersonally. Impersonal is a category that exists entirely on your end of the transaction. Harris held his gaze for a moment, then he walked out. Brian Thompson followed him to the elevator. Not as an escort, as a presence. The distinction was visible in how he moved, not controlling the space, just occupying it. Daniel stood in the center of Edward Harris's office. Deborah was already at the desk, gloved, beginning the documentation process with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew that the first 15 minutes after an executive's departure were the most legally important ones. The lawyers had their phones out. Sandra was at the window now, looking out at the same view Harris had been looking at when they walked in. The city in its October morning configuration, the highway interchange visible to the south, the cluster of midtown buildings creating their own small skyline, and past all of it the spreading residential grid of a place that contained nearly 6 million people doing ordinary things. She was holding the fountain pen at her side. Daniel walked over. He stood next to her, not close enough to crowd, close enough that she knew he was there. "How are you?" he said, tired. Very specifically tired, a pause. The kind that only happens after something you've been building toward for a long time. "When did you know it was Harris?" "Actually no, 7 months ago. Suspected earlier." But suspected isn't the same as knowing, and in a matter this size the difference between suspicion and proof is the difference between justice and a lawsuit. She looked down at the pen. "He sat in my office 3 weeks before I had the confirmation. He told me the missing shipment data suggested a warehousing level problem. He recommended tightening the dock level reporting protocols." A brief pause. "He looked me in the eye and said that he was good at it. He was excellent at it. Which is why I hired him. Which is why I kept him. The qualities that made him good at his job were the same qualities that made him effective at this. That's not your fault." "No, it's not." She said it without the hedge that would have made it sound like she was asking permission. Just stated, like something that had been worked through and arrived at and was now settled. "But I built the organization that gave those qualities room to operate in both directions at once. That part is mine. You're fixing it. I'm fixing the part I can see. There are parts I can't see yet. That's what keeps me going to parking lots at shift change and sitting on church steps." He thought about that. About the specific loneliness of running something large enough that you couldn't trust your own visibility inside it. About the choice to go sideways into the world instead of relying on the channels you were supposed to rely on. About what it cost to do that repeatedly, in city after city, alone. "Sandra, yes, after today, when this part is done, you could stop doing it the hard way." She turned to look at him. "The stops, the church steps. You have people now, you have Deborah, you have a compliance structure that actually works. You could let the system do what systems are supposed to do." "I could," she said. "But the reason I built better systems is because I stopped trusting the systems I had. That doesn't automatically resolve when the new systems are better. The distrust becomes part of how you function, so you'll just keep sitting outside at 7 a.m. indefinitely." "I'm going to try to sit outside less," she said. The corner of her mouth moved. "For a while at least, that's not a commitment." "It's an honest answer." He looked at her. At the pen in her hand and the city in front of her, and the way the morning light came through the window at the angle that October light comes through east-facing glass, which was a particular kind of light that he associated with things beginning rather than ending. "What's the thing that isn't arithmetic?" he said. She looked at him. "You said most things are arithmetic. You said you'd get back to me on the ones that aren't." A long beat. Then she said, This conversation. What happened on that sidewalk 7 weeks ago, and what's been happening since?" She looked back out the window. "I've been running numbers on everything for 6 years, since James died, and I got very good at it, because numbers don't require anything from you except accuracy. They don't ask how you're doing. They don't notice if you've been carrying something alone. James, 5 years ago. He was 29. Car accident on I-285. She said it the way people say things they've said many times to themselves and far fewer times out loud, not easily, but without the shattering that happens before you've practiced it. He was on his way back from looking at a property I needed evaluated for a possible acquisition. He was doing something for me when it happened. I've spent 6 years deciding whether to keep that fact where it is, or whether to put it somewhere else. Where have you put it? Somewhere that doesn't require me to stop working." A pause. "Which is not necessarily the right place, but has been the functional one." He was quiet. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel like you need to do something with it," she said. "I'm telling you because you asked what isn't arithmetic. And the answer is what happens when you haven't talked to someone, really talked, not reported to, not briefed, not updated in long enough that you've stopped noticing the silence. And then someone asks you a real question on a sidewalk and you realize the silence has been very loud for a very long time." Daniel looked at the side of her face. At the way she was holding herself, the specific quality of a person who is used to holding a lot without showing the holding, and who is in this moment slightly letting some of it be visible. Not performing vulnerability. The opposite. Letting something that was real be real without managing it into a presentation. "He would have liked you," Daniel said. "Based on what I'm guessing about him." She looked at him. "He sounds like someone who cared about the work you were doing and also about you doing it. People who have both of those things at once are unusual." A pause. Alicia was like that. She could hold both. She made me feel like the work and the person doing were the same thing, not competing. Sandra looked back at the window. "That's a specific gift," she said quietly. "Yes, I'm sorry you lost it. Thank you." He meant it the way he'd learned to mean it fully, without the reflexive minimization that grief trained you toward when you'd absorbed condolence for long enough. "I'm sorry you lost yours." She nodded once. A small, real nod. They stood there for a moment in the light. Below them, somewhere in the building, the federal team was doing what federal teams do. Deborah was doing what Deborah does. Brian Thompson was in the hallway being useful in the way Brian Thompson was useful. And in a room on the 16th floor, two people stood at a window and let the morning be the morning. The weeks that followed had the quality of aftermath. Not quiet, the legal process was not quiet, and the compliance work that followed the arrests was extensive and frequently required Daniel at 7 in the morning and occasionally past 9 at night. But the particular tension that had structured everything since October 9th released. What replaced it was the steadier work of consequence. Ronald Sanchez was arrested on a Wednesday morning at his house on the southwest side. He was in his kitchen when the door opened. He did not run or argue. He sat down in a chair and put his hands on his knees and looked at the officers with the expression of a man who had known for weeks that a particular morning was coming and had simply waited for it to arrive. Daniel heard about this secondhand from Deborah, who delivered information with the same economy in good news as in bad. She said, Sanchez took custody without incident, which was all she said about it, and which was enough. Timothy Clark was arrested at his office. His son, a junior at the University of Georgia, found out from a news alert before anyone called him. He was 19 years old and had done nothing wrong. And when Daniel learned this, he spent a long time thinking about the radius of harm, the way a thing done by one person spreads outward and lands on people who had no part in the decision and no ability to prevent the landing. Sandra, through Deborah, quietly arranged for a scholarship supplement through the university's financial aid office. The source was not identified. The son would eventually work it out 2 years later and would write a letter that Sandra kept in a drawer she didn't often open. Laura Clark cooperated within the first week. She provided names Daniel hadn't known, 2 people at partner organizations, 1 external consultant who had been instrumental in setting up the shell company in Delaware. Those threads led to investigations in other cities, other buildings, other configurations of the same essential crime. Thomas Rodriguez resigned from the board on a Thursday afternoon. The announcement was brief and cited personal reasons. The federal agreement that made it possible was not cited brief and time. He did not go to trial. This bothered Sandra in a way she expressed exactly once to Deborah and then filed away. Edward Harris went to trial in June, 11 counts. The courtroom in the Richard Russell building on Spring Street was wood-paneled and high-ceilinged, the kind of room that had been designed to make ordinary proceedings feel proportionate to the weight of what they decided. Daniel submitted a written victim impact statement. He did not attend. He had said what he needed to say in writing, and he had learned the distinction between what required his physical presence and what didn't. Sandra attended. She sat in the back row in a black coat with her hands folded and her face doing nothing that could be read from a distance. When the jury came back, she received the verdict with one nod and left before the formal statement. That evening she had dinner with Daniel and Zoe at the apartment. Zoe had made rice from Donna Jackson's recipe, and it was slightly underseasoned but genuinely edible, and Zoe considered this a significant personal achievement, which it was. Nobody mentioned the verdict at dinner. Zoe talked about a disagreement she'd had with her reading group about the correct interpretation of the ending of a book Daniel had not read. Sandra listened to the argument with the complete seriousness it deserved, asked 2 clarifying questions, and offered an analysis that Zoe considered for approximately 4 seconds before deciding she agreed with it. It was the most comfortable evening Daniel could remember in a long time, which he thought about afterward. What made an evening comfortable? The specific combination of things that produced it. The way Zoe had leaned forward when Sandra spoke to her, as opposed to the politely tolerating posture she maintained with adults she hadn't yet decided about. The way the apartment had felt the right size instead of the wrong one. The way the rice, slightly under-seasoned, genuinely edible, was exactly what the occasion required. Work changed in the months after. Not the nature of it. The road visits continued, the notebook continued, the Friday meetings in Sandra's office continued, but the quality of it shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely. The urgency became something different, less emergency, more architecture. The work of building a thing instead of the work of stopping a thing from falling. Daniel found he was good at both but preferred the building. He went to facilities from Virginia down to Florida and across to Texas. He sat in break rooms at 4 in the morning with workers who were skeptical and then gradually less skeptical. He asked the questions Deborah's team couldn't ask because they arrived with clipboards, and he didn't. He was the person from corporate who didn't seem like he was from corporate, which made him either trustworthy or suspicious, depending on which city and which facility and which specific combination of management decisions had preceded his arrival. He made mistakes. He misjudged a situation in Savannah and came back with an analysis that Sandra read and then put down and said without looking up. "This is incorrect." She explained why it was incorrect. He understood why it was incorrect. He went back to Savannah and looked again. He got it right the second time. She told him this was not a failure. She told him it was the only way anyone actually learned anything, by being wrong in a way they could verify and correct. She said this the way she said most things that cost her something to say, directly, without softening, but without making it smaller than it was. Zoe came to the facility on school holidays. The first time was a Monday in November, a staff development day at her school, which meant no classes and nothing for her to do except accompany her father to a nondescript building in College Park that turned out to be much more interesting than she'd expected. She sat at a spare desk with her library book and did not speak unless spoken to, which lasted approximately 40 minutes before Deborah walked past and Zoe said, "That chart on the whiteboard in the conference room is missing a variable." Deborah stopped, looked at her. "What variable?" "The time between when a shipment is logged out and when the first GPS ping appears on the tracking system. If there's a gap that's longer than the standard loading time, that's when something could happen that wouldn't show up in either record on its own." Deborah looked at Daniel. Daniel made the expression of a man who had learned not to be surprised by his daughter. "How old are you?" Deborah said. 7 3/4, Zoe said. "The 3/4 matters." Deborah pulled over a chair, sat down. "Walk me through the logic again," and Zoe did, with the patient precision of someone explaining something obvious to a capable adult who simply hadn't looked at it from the right angle yet. That evening, on the drive home, Daniel said, "You should probably warn people before you do that," Zoe said. "Warn them about what? About being smarter than them. I'm not smarter. I just read differently." A pause. "Also, I read the transit log while you were in the meeting and there was a gap, was there?" "Yes. 3 Tuesdays in a row." "You should probably tell someone," he told Deborah the next morning. Deborah pulled the logs. The gap was real. It was not connected to the current case, but pointed to a pattern at a different facility that they spent the next 6 weeks untangling. Zoe did not know this. He didn't tell her. He wasn't sure how to explain the specific mix of pride and alarm that her brain produced in him on a regular basis, so he just made sure the boots were the right size, and the library card was current, and the light in her room was good enough for reading, which was the set of things he could actually do. February, Sandra came to the apartment on a Sunday afternoon with a folder she needed to go through before a board meeting. This was true. The folder was real and required attention. But they both knew, without discussing it, that the folder was partly a reason and partly an artifact of the particular situation they'd been occupying for several months. Two people who had a great deal to say to each other and had agreed, without formal agreement, that the timing required care. Zoe was at Donna Jackson's. Donna had taken up quilting at 62, which had surprised everyone, and Zoe had become her most dedicated apprentice. They produced lopsided things with tremendous conviction. Daniel used the potholders they made on a daily basis. Sandra arrived at 1:15 in a cognac leather jacket over a cream-colored top, hair loose, the low boots she seemed to favor when she wasn't going anywhere that required the other kind. She looked like a person who had not spent the morning being a CEO, which was apparently what she looked like on Sunday afternoons when she chose her own clothes for her own reasons. He'd made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. They went through the folder. It took an hour and 40 minutes. They argued about a proposed restructuring of the Mid-Atlantic compliance reporting chain, which was not a romantic topic and which Daniel had opinions about that were different from hers, and which she eventually partly incorporated into her thinking with the specific form of concession that wasn't capitulation, the kind where someone changes their mind because you gave them a better argument, not because you pressed harder. He found that form of concession more persuasive than most things. When the folder was finished, she stood up and walked to the window. She'd done this before. The particular pattern of movement she made when she was transitioning between modes, between the focus of work and whatever came after. She stopped at the shelf by the window, the photo of Alicia. She looked at it for a long moment. Long enough that it wasn't accidental. "You've never asked about her," Daniel said, from the kitchen table. "I've been waiting for you to decide if you wanted to tell me." He thought about that. About the difference between waiting to be invited and waiting for readiness. "Stone Mountain," he said. You know the photo. I know the photo. That was the summer before Zoe was born. We'd been trying to camp there for 2 years and kept not managing it. We finally went and forgot half of what we needed." He paused. "She found it funny. She found almost everything funny. She had this quality, whatever was in front of her was worth her full attention. And she gave it. She didn't reserve herself." He stopped. "I'm not sure I can describe it better than that." "You described it well." "She would have opinions about you." Sandra turned. "What kind of opinions? Positive ones?" "She would have found the arithmetic thing funny. She would have asked you questions that seemed simple and weren't." He paused. "She would have noticed the loneliness before it did." Sandra was quiet. "Is it that visible?" she said. "Not generally. No. To her it would have been." He looked at his hands, at the coffee cup in front of him. "She had that gift. You've mentioned that quality before. It was her most specific thing. She was very specific." Sandra came back to the table, not to sit. She stood at it, at the corner nearest the window, and she looked at him with the expression he'd started to be able to read, the one that arrived when she had decided to say something that she couldn't fully control, the landing of Daniel. "Yeah, you are the only person I've talked to in 6 years who doesn't primarily see me as a function." A pause. You'll see what I do, they see what I represent. Even people who know me well see the edges of the thing I've built around myself, and they interact with those edges. They don't press," she said the word carefully. "You ask the questions that go under the surface. You've done it since the first morning, and I've noticed, and I keep noticing." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "I want to be clear about that. You're navigating something that requires time, and I'm not going to crowd that process. But I want you to know I notice, and that the noticing matters to me in a way I don't have neater language for." He thought for a moment about what to say. About Alicia. About the specific texture of the year after she died. About how grief wasn't a thing you moved through to get to the other side of, but a thing that restructured you, that changed the geography of your interior life, and that you learned to live in the new landscape rather than returning to the old one. About how the landscape had been changing again, slowly, since October 9th. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't something," he said, "because that would require pretending I don't know what I know about what's been happening. And I've never been good at pretending, I know. But I need to do this at the speed it actually needs to happen at. I know that too. Which might feel slower than Daniel." Her voice was patient, not amused. Something warmer than professional. "I've waited 6 years to have a Sunday afternoon conversation like this one. I can wait longer than you think." He looked at her. She looked back. And in the kitchen, in the February afternoon, with the folder closed and the coffee cooling and the faint sound of the laundromat below, something between them adjusted, not resolved, not concluded, just acknowledged, named, given the dignity of being taken seriously. "There's one more thing," he said. "Okay, whatever this is, Zoe, this is about it. Not through me managing the information. Through her just knowing, because she knows everything. So whenever there's something she should formally know, she should hear it from us. Of course, she'll have opinions. I'm counting on it." The corner of Sandra's mouth moved. Based on evidence, he almost laughed. She actually did, just slightly, just for a second, in the way she laughed when she'd stop at managing what her face was doing. Spring came to Atlanta the way it always does, without asking permission. The temperature rose and the azaleas committed to their annual spectacle along the belt line, and the sweet Auburn market started its Saturday mornings again, and the city's particular energy, the one that had been muted through winter, returned like a sound you'd almost stopped expecting to hear. Zoe turned 8 in March. Daniel threw a party that was, by his definitions, small 8 children supervised by him and Donna and Sandra, who had arrived with the cake she had attempted to make herself, and which had an architectural instability in the frosting layer that suggested she had made the batter correctly, and the assembly somewhat creatively. Zoe looked at the cake with the evaluating expression of a person who was deciding something. "I like it," she said. Sandra said, It's leaning. Leaning is interesting. The second layer may not survive the first 30 minutes. Then we'll eat fast. Zoe had already gotten the serving knife. Come help me cut it. Sandra went to help her cut the cake. And Daniel stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched them, Zoe in her birthday crown, Sandra in her weekend clothes. The two of them arguing affectionately about the angle of the first cut, and felt something that he didn't have the correct word for, and didn't try to find one. Some things you just hold. The summer, August. The weekend in Tybee Island that Zoe had been lobbying for since May, on the grounds that she had never seen the ocean, and that this was a significant gap in her development. Brian Thompson drove them in a Tahoe, not the armored SUV, because Sandra had asked for that, and Brian had declined to have feelings about it in any visible way. The house was small, on a street 2 blocks from the beach. Zoe was in the sand within 11 minutes of arrival. She spent 3 hours on Saturday morning collecting things: shells, sea glass, a piece of driftwood that she decided was a naturally occurring piece of sculpture, and brought back to the porch. Daniel and Sandra were on the porch with coffee. She was reading. He was watching the water. Neither of them was talking, and this had become one of the qualities of being in each other's company, that neither of them commented on the specific ease of shared silence, which is not the same as absence of connection, but is sometimes its most honest form. Daniel, yeah, have you thought about it? He didn't ask what it was. He'd known this conversation was close for some time. The way you know a shift in weather before it arrives, not from any single thing, but from the total accumulation of the atmosphere. A lot, he said, and he set his coffee down, turned and to look at her. She was looking at him, the expression he associated with her complete attention. Nothing managed, nothing curated, just her full focus on a thing she'd decided required it. I love Alicia, he said. That doesn't go away, it restructures. She's part of how I see the world, how I think about what's worth doing and how to do it. That's not going to change, and I don't want it to. I know, and I love what I feel when I'm with you. Which is different from that. Completely different. It's its own thing. She held very still. So what I'm telling you, he said, is that I'm not choosing between them. There isn't a choice. There's just what's true. And what's true is that I'm in love with you, and I've been in love with you for a while. And I've been slow about saying it because I wanted to say it when it was the whole thing, and not part of something I was still working through. And now it's the whole thing. She put her book down. She put her coffee down. She reached across the small table between them and put her hand on top of his, not quickly, deliberately. The way she did most things that cost her something fully, without hedging. I've been in love with you, she said, since approximately the moment you told me your wife used to say the world runs on small things people do for each other. And I have been waiting for you to be ready to hear that. And I think I managed the waiting reasonably. You managed it. I am excellent at managing things, you are, including the wanting to not wait. He turned his hand under hers, held it properly. Below them on the beach, zzzed Brian Thompson, a piece of sea glass with the gravity of a person presenting scientific findings. Brian Thompson was listening with complete seriousness, which was, Daniel thought, one of Brian Thompson's underrated qualities. They got married in October, 2 years from the morning he'd signed the termination notice in George White's office. The church Greater Bethel AIM had finished its renovation the previous spring. The scaffolding was gone, the netting was gone. The front facade was clean brick, restored, looking the way it must have looked when it was first built decades ago. Solid and unconcerned with time. The pastor had placed a small bronze plaque on the front steps, not commissioned, not asked for, just placed, because the story had moved through the neighborhood the way stories do in places where people know each other, and the congregation had decided Teps deserved a marker. Someone stopped here. That changed everything. No names, no date. Daniel had seen it for the first time in April, arriving early for a meeting with the pastor about the ceremony. He'd stood at those steps for 10 minutes, with one hand on the door handle and the other in his pocket, and his eyes doing something he didn't fully have control over. Then he'd taken out his phone and called Sandra. She'd gone quiet on the line for a long time. Then she'd said, in the voice she used when she was very close to crying but had decided against it, that might be the most Atlanta thing that has ever happened. 22 people came. San door open with a brick. The same brick that had been there on the morning 2 years ago when Daniel had rolled down his window and said, "Hey, are you okay?" Donna Jackson in a burgundy dress she'd sewn herself, Alicia's scarf at her neck. Deborah White with her reading glasses, which she kept on for the ceremony and claimed afterward were prescription distance glasses, and she'd simply forgotten to take them off, and which everyone pretended to believe. Brian Thompson, in a tie that matched nothing and everything, stationed near the iron gate because he couldn't entirely stop doing the thing he did, which was be present in a way that was protective without being obtrusive. Kenneth Lee, Daniel's brother, 36 years old, sold commercial real estate in Decatur, had called Daniel twice in the months after the arrest and said the wrong thing both times in the specific way of people who care and don't know the correct language for it. He was in a suit that fit better than the last one he'd worn to a family event, which had been a funeral, which was a fact that hung briefly in the air between them at the rehearsal dinner the night before, and then resolved into something that felt more like recognition than grief. Eric King with someone he'd been seeing since the spring, and who shook Daniel's hand with the specific warmth of someone who'd heard a story and was glad to meet the person it was about. George White in the back, by the fence, holding his hat in his hands because he hadn't been sure whether to wear it inside and had defaulted to not. He and Daniel had spoken twice since the trial. The conversations had been what they were, not resolved exactly, but real. George had not been able to look at Daniel directly during either conversation, and Daniel had accepted that as the particular form of apology a man offers when he doesn't have words for the thing he actually did. In the time since, George had submitted an internal complaint about the maintenance conditions at 3 Meridian facilities that had been sitting in the request queue since 2021. The complaints had been addressed. That was the form his amends took. Daniel had no objection to that form. Betty Gonzalez, 72 years old, former justice of the peace, current owner of the hardware store 2 blocks down that sold the only adequate cork gun in a 3-mile radius, officiated. She'd worn a green dress and flat shoes and had opinions about how ceremonies should run, which was to say she had one opinion, which was that they should be short enough to hold a person's attention and long enough to say the real thing. She said, these 2 people walked into the same hard morning from opposite directions. They didn't know what they were walking into, they just walked. And what they found at the intersection of it was each other, and I've officiated enough of these to know that what they found is the kind of thing you don't manufacture and can't plan for. You can only be available to it. She paused. Be available to each other, she said. That's the whole vow underneath all the words. Zoe was the flower girl. She had researched this role extensively. She had opinions about the petals specifically, that rose petals were statistically overrepresented in this context, and that marigolds, which were in season and were her personal aesthetic preference, were a more interesting choice. The marigolds were orange and gold, and they scattered ahead of her down the makeshift aisle in the churchyard with the specific energy of a 7-year-old who has decided that this is important and is going to do it correctly. She was wearing a dress the color of amber, which she had chosen herself, and which made her look like someone who had been considering the possibilities and selected the best one. She walked the whole length with her chin up and her basket held in both hands. She looked at her father when she reached the front. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look said what it said, something between I know what this is, and I'm okay, and I trust you, and I'm watching, which was the look she'd been giving him for 4 years, since she was small enough that it had come from below. Now she was 8 3/4. The look came level Daniel's vows. He'd written them 6 times. The first 5 versions had been true, but not quite it. The 6th version was 4 sentences. He looked at Sandra when he said them. On the worst morning of my life, I stopped the car. Not because I expected anything. Because there was still a part of me that hadn't been taken by the bad morning. I'm marrying you because you saw that part before I remembered it was there, Sandra's vows. She'd written hers once. She said she'd known what she wanted to say since the Sunday afternoon in February and had only been waiting for the appropriate occasion. She looked at him. I sat on those steps because I'd stopped believing that honest people existed in the places where I most needed them. You drove past me, and then you turned around. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for the turning around. They exchanged rings, they kissed. It was not a long kiss. It was a small, correct kiss in a churchyard that was full of people who had earned the right to witness it. The 22 people applauded. A car passing on Edgewood honked the driver, having no idea what was happening on the sidewalk, which was fine. Uninformed honking at the right moment was its own kind of benediction. The reception was dinner in the back garden of a restaurant on Auburn that had known Donna Jackson for 30 years and had given them the space with a warmth that felt like the neighborhood saying yes. Toasts were made. Deborah's was unexpectedly funny and involved a story from 3 years before Daniel's that demonstrated Sandra had always had a specific weakness for people who said true things directly. Kenneth's was heartful in the way of someone who had found the right words on the third try. Donna's was 3 sentences that contained everything necessary and nothing extra. Zoe danced with her father first, standing on his shoes, which she announced before doing it was a thing she was doing as a childhood classic, and not because she needed the physical support, and the distinction was important. Then she danced with Sandra, not on her shoes, standing on her own because she was 8 3/4 and capable of the thing herself. And at some point in the late evening, Daniel went outside to the small back courtyard. October in Atlanta at night, warm enough for just the jacket he had on. A string of lights along the pergola. The sound of the party through the door, laughter, the scrape of chairs, music from a small speaker that someone had found the perfect volume for. He stood and he thought, about a morning 2 years ago. About $38 in a wallet and a termination notice and a parking lot and a raccoon at a dumpster that he'd found encouraging, which was its own kind of information about where his head had been that morning. About a woman in a camel coat on a church step. About Zoe's hand on his at the kitchen table, sticky from something, saying I know you didn't, in the tone of a person who had already checked the evidence and returned a verdict. About the specific texture of a hard year. About how you survive something like that not by being stronger than it, but by remaining the person you were before it happened, in the small ways, the daily ways, the way you'll keep a hand extended when it's easier not to, about what that costs. About what it opens. The door behind him opened. Sandra came out. She'd changed her shoes, the heels were gone, replaced with something flat, and she was carrying her jacket instead of wearing it, because the Georgia night was doing what Georgia nights do, which was being entirely reasonable about October in a way that suited the occasion. You're missing the good part, she said. What's the good part? Zoe is explaining to Brian Thompson why the music selection at receptions is statistically suboptimal. Is Brian taking notes? He has a napkin, Daniel laughed. A real one. Not the kind that happens when something is funny enough, but the kind that comes from somewhere lower. From relief and recognition and the accumulated weight of everything that had brought this to this courtyard on this night, Sandra came and stood beside him. Close, because there was no longer a reason not to be close. He took her hand. She held his. Properly, all the way you hold something you intend to keep, Sandra. What made you turn back around? She looked at him. At the church steps, he said, I drove past you, and then I turned around, and I've wondered what made me do that. You saw me, I see a lot of people. You saw that I'd been there a while, a pause. People who have been anywhere too long by themselves develop a specific quality. It's not sadness exactly. It's the quality of someone who has stopped expecting the next thing. She looked at the lights. You saw that, and you decided you didn't want to be someone who drove past it. He thought about that. About all the mornings before October 9th when he'd driven that route. About whether he would have stopped on another morning, a less disrupted morning, a morning where he had more. He thought he would have. But he wasn't certain, and the uncertainty was useful not as guilt, but as information. About what it took to see clearly. About how much of ordinary perception was filtered through the comfort of having enough. The world runs on small things people do for each other, he said. When there's nothing in it for them, she finished. Was she right? Sandra was quiet for a moment. About the world running on it? I think it runs on many things, most of which are not small and most of which are not generous. She paused. But I think she was right that those small things are the ones that change the direction. The small things are the pivots. Everything else is momentum. He looked at her. She looked at him, and the world went on around them, the laughter from inside, the October night, the string lights and the city, and the ongoing ordinary miracle of a place full of people doing their best with what they had. Zoe appeared in the doorway. She looked at them. She assessed the situation with the specific efficiency of someone who had expected to find this and had found it. Brian needs your opinion on the music, she said. Does he? Daniel said. He's being diplomatic. He actually needs someone to override the current playlist. Sandra said. What's wrong with the current playlist? It's fine. That's what's wrong with it. Zoe considered this position complete and returned inside. Daniel looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at him. They went inside. The good part was still going. It went for a long time. Maybe the lesson is not that kindness comes back. Mostly, it doesn't. Mostly you give away what you have and get nothing but the giving. But the giving changes something in you. It maintains a part of you that would otherwise be lost to all the mornings that don't go the way you hoped. And then one Tuesday, on a hard street, someone looks at that part and recognizes it and turns around. That's the whole thing. That's all of it.